Hi folks, John Dunn here, RPG freelancer, publisher behind Meliorvia. I'm up here today at Immortals Inc. with Mikey.
What is up, John? It is a beautiful day, beautiful week. What are we talking about?
We are talking about conspiracies today.
Oh gosh, man.
And not just any conspiracies, but conspiracies from the 90s, the era when we had the X-Files and conspiracy theories, were a big part of the internet and the World Wide Web getting its launch back in the 90s.
I mean, conspiracy might have been at its peak.
I kind of feel that way, right?
Yeah.
This was the era where every crackpot crazy conspiracy theory had somebody behind it out there on the internet from, use your own imagination. Or Google the Internet Archive.
Yeah, please.
In any case, around that same time was when Delta Green first came out. And we've talked about Delta Green
before,
a while,
right?
It's
been a while.
It's from Detwiller, Clancy, Tynes are the original trio, and then Caleb Stokes combined in for this book. There's a Kickstarter in August of 2021 that raised $513,000, and this book came out in March of 2023. This is Delta Green, The Conspiracy. This kind of black and white matches up nicely with the current line of Delta Green books. And then you've got this kind of mysterious looking cover here with the green Greek Delta, that triangle there on the cover, and some nice little...
Very ominous.
Yes, variegated material there on the cover. And it's got a little texture too.
If you know, you know.
So when Delta Green originally came out, it was in the 90s. So it was kind of a modern Cthulhu setting. It originally came out in 1997. During the height of the D20 craze, they did a D20 version in 2007. And that current rule set came out in 2016 and 2017. Now, with the 2016-2017 update, they very much made an effort to make the game current, right? So smartphones kind of showed up in those 20 years in between, and the web became something that we had on our person at all times. This book kind of goes back and says, well, that's great, but what if we want to play in the 90s? And so it kind of de-updates the new version to go back and re-encompass everything that was in that original version that came back in 1997. Now, this is not a standalone RPG. It is a source book that does require the Agent's Handbook and the Handler's Guide from the current rule set. It's also not compatible with the Fall of Delta Green, which was the gumshoe version that we talked about previously from Pelgrane. You could use this with that as an alternative setting for it, but it is a different rule system that's implicit in here. And it's kind of weird, but for me at least, this is 25 years old, so really enough time has passed that the 1990s are now a genre book of sense. This is much like, you ever watch the TV show Happy Days?
No.
Never saw Happy Days.
No.
With
Are you
the
surprised?
Fonz. I'm very surprised at this, but Happy Days was set in kind of this iconic vision of the 50s, right? Well, it was made in the 70s, so about 20 years had passed between...
That's so trippy to think about.
Yeah, right. So this is kind of the same way. About 25 years have passed since the 1990s, so now we can make a source book about that.
I'm confused.
Yeah, so breaking down the book, it opens up with Agents and Friendlies. This is about 25 pages, and it walks you through character creation and the way that cells were organized during this kind of cowboy era, this private, isolated, cell-based era of Delta Green in the 90s, where they were not officially government agents and they were fighting Cthulhu essentially on their own, using maybe some government assets that they had kind of stolen for their own purposes. There's 12 pages where it talks about the campaign, some tips for the handler, and kind of an overview of this book, and brief touches on the cosmic horrors and alien intelligences that Delta Green was working against during this era. Then there's 25 pages that cover Delta Green. It talks about the 1928 Innsmouth origins, the organization as it related to ONI and the OSS in 1948, and then how the organization was basically disbanded in 1970 and talks about the NPCs and what they did and how they might tie in with these characters that are continuing that organization's mission on their own in these cells. And it kind of assumes that the characters are participating in a cell structure organization. I keep saying cells. Do you know what that means, Mikey?
I was about to ask you, what does cell mean? Like, what is that?
So a terrorist group or an espionage group
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
is a cell, right? And there's usually just a few people. They may not know each other very well, but they have a common mission. And they might have contacts in other parts of the organization. Each of those different groups are cells. And usually each member of a cell will know only the people in their own cell and maybe one person outside of it who belongs to a different cell. And that way, if a cell becomes compromised, you're not compromising the whole organization at once. You're just compromising that cell and maybe part of an adjacent cell. There's a few pages on the fungi from Yuggoth. This is basically the Migo as we know them in other Cthulhu assets that kind of originated in Lovecraft's The Whisperers in Darkness story. The important restriction on the Migo as they're presented here is that they can't really innovate. So they think in massively parallel processes, but they don't come up with new ideas. And because of that, they're always looking for brains in jars, or they're capturing brains, sticking them in jars, and making them think for them in new ways. Yeah. After that, there's about 40 pages on Majestic. This is a competing group that is actually part of the U.S. government during this era in the Delta Green timeline. Majestic got their start when Roswell happened in 1947. And they're basically the government organization that displaced Delta Green, and they work with and for the Greys, the classic Whitley Strieber aliens with the big eyes and the gray skin that, fly UFOs and the flying saucer type things.
What everybody thinks aliens look like.
Well, at least one of the
one of the many
species. And the Greys have connections to global military intelligence. They've provided Majestic with some advanced tech, and they can do this, and America's willing to turn a blind eye because there's an agreement that these aliens won't harvest Americans for their body parts. Now, the Greys are actually agents of the Migo. That's a thing that Majestic isn't really aware of, but Delta Green might be. After that, the next big chunk of the book's about 20 pages is Karotechia. Karotechia is a Nazi conspiracy that's based in Brazil, has global connections, and has undead Nazis.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, so are we talking about like a Draugr type of undead, or are we talking about a zombie type of undead?
We are talking mostly ghoulish undead. Yeah, so these are...
So scary, very scary.
Yeah, and these are actual members of the World War II Nazi leadership who have become immortalized and are living in Brazil and continuing to try to advance their schemes.
I hope they're not wearing their same uniforms.
Well, maybe not in public, but probably. Another next 15 pages covers Saucer Watch. This is a group of UFO investigators who are basically civilians, public. They're people that are working against Majestic without knowing that they're working against Majestic. They think there is a big government flying saucer cover-up, and sometimes members of Delta Green might be able to leverage their enthusiasm.
Basically the History Channel.
Kinda, yeah. Next chunk of the book, about 15 pages, is The Fate and Club Apocalypse. This is a club that's in New York City. It's part of the nightlife, the scene there. And there's a guy by the name of Stephen Alzes who runs Club Apocalypse. He's a crime lord, and he's probably an avatar of Nyarlathotep. Yeah, so it kind of ties into that. He's in charge of the Fate. He's atop the network, which is basically a group of mafias, right? A group of different crime syndicates. And the nightclub is probably an occult meeting site, in addition to, being the hip happening place where artists hang out and also mobsters hang out. So you got this kind of neat area in the middle of New York City with just a ton of hooks that can draw your characters into it from a broad range of different angles, only to have things go horrifically wrong since, Nyarlathotep. After that, there's about 50 pages of appendices. It covers feds in the 90s, different security classifications, a glossary of terms, a section talking about the unnatural, and an index and a bibliography. There's an awful lot going on here. If you are interested in running Delta Green during this era, this is an absolutely essential book. It's from Arc Dream Publishing. It's about 220 pages. It is a full-color hardcover. It has some really cool artwork interspersed throughout, and it is $45. Got it up here on the shelf at Immortals or available at immortalsinc.com.
Well said, my friend. Go back to the 90s. I dare you.
Till next time, good gaming, folks.